Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a special New Year's Eve broadcast on KLCC News 2. Before we make our transition into the 70s, let's take a good look back at the memorable events that brought the American people and our society together as one in the decade of the 1960s. Communism has been a fear of the American people since the beginning of the Cold War in 1945. The Cuban Missile Crisis shocked the nation in 1962, leading to a great fear of full-on nuclear war within our great nation. The Cuban Missile Crisis made us Americans realize how great this threat of communism has become and how many of our lives have been impacted by it. Following this great scare in 1963, the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was ratified. This treaty helped ease the fear for a while, but did not mark the end of our worries. In 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident occurred, furthering our involvement in Vietnam to prevent the spread of communism. Vietnamese people fired on the USS Maddox, directly threatening Americans and calling for repercussions from the United States. 1964 also marked the development of atomic bombs by China, causing more worry for America and other great nations around the world. A year passed and U.S. Marines were sent to fight the spread of communism in the Dominican Republic. This expanded on the desires Americans had to end communism around the world and strengthened support for the Marines. This year also marked the dispatching of 200,000 troops in Vietnam, leading to controversy and distrust between Americans and their government. Vietnam and communism lit a fire in Americans to protest and make their voices heard for what they believe in. As we bring in the 1970s, the Cold War in Vietnam continued to be an issue for Americans. Communism continues to cause constant fear throughout the nation, and the Cold War continues with hopes of an end somewhere in the near future.
Thanks, Cody. The war on communism has thus far consisted of proxy wars in Korea and Vietnam, the latter of which reaching its peak during this decade. The 60s saw an increase of American involvement in Vietnam. In 1960, the National Liberation Front, created to oppose the new anti-communist president of Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem, was met with strong resistance by the American forces, which expanded from less than 800 troops in the late 50s to over 9,000 troops. As you may remember, the supplies required to sustain these troops took resources and money from Johnson's Great Society Plan of 1964, which included a number of reform programs and promises of racial and social justice for the American people. For those of you who may have missed the news, protests for the last decade included the resistance against the drafting of soldiers for the American Army. Some fled to Canada to the draft, while others formed groups to oppose the draft, such as Students for a Democratic Society, which conducted a number of sit-ins. Others included the March on the Lincoln Memorial and the Pentagon of 1967, and the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, who threw away their medals to rouse the anti-war protesters. The war in Vietnam looked favorably upon some presidents, while others saw a decrease in voter morale. Although John F. Kennedy was killed before the war grew in scale, President Lyndon B. Johnson's reputation gradually sank with his addition of more troops to the war effort, as well as anti-war fervor, and Johnson himself refused a second term in office. Now, we look to newly elected President Richard M. Nixon for guidance. A significant event to remember from this Vietnam War in the past decade was the Tet Offensive of 1968, a vile and repulsive action by the Viet Cong and the Communist people of North Vietnam, approximately 2 years ago. In celebration of the Lunar New Year, the Viet Cong attacked more than 100 cities and towns in South Vietnam. General William Westmoreland asked for more troop support, creating a desperate atmosphere for Johnson's presidency. Other important events to remember include Operation Ranch Hand and Agent Orange, which, as you may remember, was the use of deadly herbicides to remove the forests of North Vietnam and draw out the Viet Cong from their hiding places. Let us hope that President Nixon will find a more suitable ending to this war. Now we move on to Elizabeth, who will tell us more about Johnson's presidency.
The key turning point of the campaign came with the 4 Kennedy-Nixon debates. Kennedy was always able to capture the attention of the people, as he had the ability to speak directly to the camera and the national audience while keeping a calm, poised status during the debates, whereas his opponent, Nixon, appeared to be responding to Kennedy and had not fully recovered from a recent hospital stay, thus looking pale and sickly. Those watching the debate felt that Kennedy had won, giving him an edge in the campaigns, as it shows that 4 million voters made up their mind as a result of the debate.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Political changes came in negative waves as well. The turbulent nature of the decade was evidenced by the numerous protest movements that surfaced during the 60s. Negative feeling towards political leaders, wars, and discrimination sparked a generation of hope and the desire for a better tomorrow. Protests took place on college campuses across the United States. Young people against Vietnam gathered in hopes that political figures would change the direction our nation was heading in. Women also gathered and continued to fight for gender equality and rights to birth control. Environmentalists continue to fight for a response to the use of hazardous chemicals in our nation. Now on to Nada for more about civil rights.
Thank you, Cody. Most notable of the protest movements was the Civil Rights Movement, a race of people eager for equality banding together in order to win the rights they had fought for since before they could remember. Nearly 100 years ago, the Emancipation Proclamation was passed. However, African Americans in the South were still facing intense forms of oppression and discrimination. Jim Crow laws, which were enforced at the local and state level, restricted African Americans from classrooms, bathrooms, theaters, and even juries and legislatures. And although in 1954 the separate but equal doctrine was shut down by the Supreme Court, the African Americans didn't stop standing up for their rights. Throughout the decade, civil rights activists such as Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X and many others attended nonviolent protests and used civil disobedience to help make changes. Protest that supports the use of nonviolence is Birmingham and the March on Washington, which included protesters and school children on one side, and police with clubs, fire hoses, and police dogs on the other side. The protests introduced a new side of fighting for social rights without violence and resulted in a very large protest called the March on Washington, in which Martin Luther King Jr. presented his I Have a Dream speech. With an increase of these protests of 1963, many white people opposed and rejected the spread of them, but it aided the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And now, here's Olivia with our next story.
With positive political changes also came negatives. The turbulent nature of the 60s was evidenced by the numerous tragedies that marked the decade. Many notable assassinations occurred because of growing tensions between American people and the political system, as well as within the civil rights movement. On November 22, 1963, President John Fitzgerald Kennedy was campaigning for re-election in 1964 in Dallas, Texas. During a motorcade through Dealey Plaza, Lee Harvey Oswald shot and killed Kennedy and wounded Governor John Connally. Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in aboard Air Force One at Love Field. 2 days later, Lee Harvey Oswald was shot and killed by Jack Ruby in the basement of the Dallas Police Headquarters. On February 21, 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated at the Audubon Ballroom in Washington Heights by rival black Muslims while addressing the Organization of Afro-American Unity. Talmadge Hayer, Norman 3X Butler, and Thomas 15X Johnson were all convicted of murder in March of 1966 and sentenced to life in prison. On April 4, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was shot and killed by James Earl Ray while standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. Ray was seen fleeing the scene, which led to a worldwide manhunt. 2 months later, Ray was arrested at London's Heathrow Airport. His death led to a widening of the already present rift between African Americans and white citizens and fueled the growth of the Black Power movement in the late 1990s. On June 5, 1968, Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated by Saran while campaigning for the 1968 Democratic Party presidential candidate. Minutes after winning the California primary, Kennedy addressed his supporters in the ballroom of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. On his way out of the ballroom, Kennedy turned to greet a busboy in the kitchen. Saran shot and killed him. His death led to a split in the Democratic Party, and the election of 1968 was won by Republican Richard Nixon, who had formerly lost to Robert Kennedy's brother John in 1960.
This is a man who smokes Marlboro cigarettes. What kind of a man is he?
I'm a guy who likes to work on my car. I like to take it apart and put it back together. I get to working on it and forget where I am, what time it is. I even forget to eat.
You don't forget to smoke, though.
I always smoke when I work. They go together.
Why Marlboro?
Well, it's a combination of things. When I draw on a cigarette, I want to taste something. With Marlboro, I do. Yet it's got a filter that works. Then there's this flip-top box. I like things that are well designed. This box is interesting and practical.
Would you recommend Marlboro to your friends?
I already have.
New Marlboro. Filter, flavor, flip-top box. Popular filter price.
Along with notable political leaders, a prominent pop culture icon's life also came to an end. Marilyn Monroe was at the peak of her career when it came to a grinding halt. This event evidenced the danger of the fast and reckless lifestyle many people lived during the decade. On August 5, 1962, Marilyn Monroe was found dead in her home in Los Angeles. She was found laying in her bed face down with a telephone in one hand and empty bottles of medication prescribed for her depression were found scattered throughout the room. After a brief investigation, the police came to the conclusion that the motive for death was probable suicide and was caused by self-administered overdose of sedative drugs. Marilyn's death caused a shock throughout the nation, and her legacy has continued to remain throughout the decade.
The darkness and mystery surrounding Marilyn's death would not be the last incident shrouded in obscurity. The Manson family murders were unprecedented and horrifying events which were perhaps the most disturbing events in American history. The murders shocked the nation and led to a widespread paranoia. Charles Manson was the leader of a quasi-commune that arose in the late 60s. He had a number of followers, most notably Linda Kasabian, Tex Watson, Mary Brunner, Lynette Fromme, Susan Atkins, and Patricia Krenwinkel. Manson brainwashed his followers to murder citizens to incite a race war that he called Helter Skelter. The Manson family was behind the July 25, 1969 murders of Gary Hinman, the August 9, 1969 murders of 8 months pregnant actress Sharon Tate, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, and Stephen Parent, and the August 10, 1969 murders of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca. The murders shared a common factor of brutal and merciless wounds, as well as words like political piggy painted in blood on the walls of the scene. The murders created mass paranoia throughout the nation. Manson and his family members are still awaiting trial.
Thank you, Olivia. The phenomenon that occurred as the British invasion in the mid-60s was when rock and pop culture acts from the United Kingdom became increasingly popular in the United States. This style of music became the significance of the counterculture that began to rise among the citizens of the U.S., particularly among the young. The rebellious tone and image of this style of music attracted the interest of many Americans.
Thank you, Elizabeth. In Bethel, New York, on August 15th through 18th of 1969, the Woodstock Music and Art Festival was held. Over 500,000 people attended to hear the 32 acts, which included Jimi Hendrix, The Who, Janis Joplin and Crosby, Stills, Jefferson Airplane, and many others. These 3 days of peace and music were described as chaotic because of minimum amount of bathrooms and first aid tents. Other than the one teen who was accidentally run over by a tractor and the other who died of overdose, there were few violent actions. Joni Mitchell described the event as a spark of beauty where 500,000 kids saw that they were part of a greater organization. Woodstock. 4 days of music, 500,000 people, rain, and the rest is history. And now here's Robin with our next topic.
Less than a year ago, the first men made their mark on science with a historic moon landing. Back in 1961, President John F. Kennedy made an announcement. It reads as such: I believe this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. To address the issue, NASA spent the majority of the next decade designing and preparing a spacecraft for this purpose. 4 years ago, NASA conducted its first unmanned mission in space. The next year, 1967, was a tragic year for the space program when 3 astronauts were killed when the spacecraft burst into flames. 2 years ago, Apollo 7 orbited Earth, and Apollo 8 successfully made it to the dark side of the moon and back. Finally, in early 1969, Apollo 9 tested a lunar module in space, and Apollo 10 took a ship for a test run around the moon. America was finally ready to land on the moon. Viewers will remember the excitement that surrounded the crew of Apollo 11. On July 16, 1969, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins took off from the Kennedy Space Station into the vastness of space. 4 days later, Armstrong stepped off the module and uttered the historic words that will surely be remembered for many years to come. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. A giant leap indeed, as Armstrong and Aldrin placed an American flag on the moon's surface, took tested samples, and spoke to President Nixon on the phone. 2 days later, the spacecraft began its journey home and landed safely in the Pacific on the 24th. Let it be known that the Americans, not the Soviets, were the first men to step on the moon.